Good evening, everyone, and happy Halloween. Now, if you've been watching for a while, you already know that this is my favourite night of the entire year. The air feels colder, the shadows stretch a little longer, and the stories we tell tonight, they're not just stories, they're warnings, they're echoes, they're reminders that not everything can be explained. And that's why tonight's episode is different, because this is my Halloween special, a night dedicated to the strange, the haunted, and the utterly unexplainable. So, if you're new here, my name is Raphael Rogerson. I'm a lawyer by day and a storyteller of the unexplained by night. And tonight, I have not one, but two tales to share with you. First, we travel to the rolling fields of Tennessee, where a voice in the dark cursed an entire family, and a witch kept her promise long after death. And in the second story, we'll ride into the fog-choked woods of Sleepy Hollow, where superstition and vengeance takes the form of a headless rider. So, turn down the lights, pour yourself something warm, because tonight, we're not just telling stories, we're summoning them. Have you ever noticed how some stories refuse to die? How they linger, like a whisper behind you when you're all alone? Well, this one begins in the year 1817 in a quiet, God-fearing corner of northern Tennessee in the United States of America. In this part of the world, life moved slowly. The days were long and the nights were darker than ink. And the Bell family, John, Lucy, and their children, lived on a stretch of farmland in a place called Red River. And they were prosperous, they were respected, and they were a kind of family that everyone in town just trusted. But that peace was about to shatter. The first signs began, as evil often does, quietly. So, one still evening, John Bell, he walked to the cornfield outside his house to inspect a strange noise. Now, he didn't know what this noise was, but what he could hear was this rustling of something large moving against the wind. So he walks out and he looks towards the cornfield, but he doesn't see anything. And he starts to question himself, as if asking whether he actually did hear anything in the first place. So he shrugs and he's about to walk away when he suddenly sees something. Something catches his eye. And it's not just something small, they're two eyes that are staring right at him. Now, John didn't know what this creature was. Its body appeared large, almost like a dog, but its head was more like a rabbit with large ears just pointing out. And its eyes, they were pale, unblinking, and they were staring straight into his. Now, John didn't hesitate for a second. He raised his musket and he fired, and just like that, the creature vanished. No sound, no body, no blood, nothing but silence. So that night, John told himself that it had to be a figment of his imagination. I mean, it was a long day, it was incredibly tired, and the fact of the matter is, monsters, they don't exist. That creature was probably a large black dog or a wolf, definitely not a monster. But as he lay in bed, the scratching started. Soft at first, and then louder, almost like claws beneath the floorboards, dragging slowly, rhythmically, as if something was crawling through the walls. So John, he gets up, lantern in hand, but finds nothing. The next day, he hears the sound again. But again, he finds nothing. And the next day, it happens again. So soon, all of a sudden, the whole family could hear this noise. It's scratching, but it's also tapping, it's knocking, and every sound seemed to come from inside of the house. And then came the voices. At first, it was a whisper. Low, breathy, impossible to understand, but after weeks, the words became clear. The voices said only three words: John, Lucy, and Betsy. With that, John Bell's youngest daughter, Betsy Bell, became the focus of this strange phenomena. Her bed would shake violently as if gripped by unseen hands, her blankets were torn away, and once, as her brothers rushed into the room, they found her lifted off the bed, suspended for a moment before being thrown to the floor. And to make it worse, she constantly woke up covered in red marks, and not just any red marks, finger-shaped welts burned across her cheeks. So whatever was in that house, It wanted Betsy, and it wanted John Bell. Soon, the voice grew strong enough for everyone to hear, and it spoke not as an echo, but as a woman. Now, sometimes gentle, sometimes mocking, sometimes shrieking with laughter so loud, the walls would actually shake. Now, after weeks and weeks of this terror, it was very clear that this was not a shared hallucination, and it certainly wasn't a coincidence. So the family, after all this time trying to ignore what was happening to them, decided to confront that very thing that was terrorizing them, and they demanded to know who this spirit was. And almost like this spirit was waiting for this very question, all of a sudden, the laughter stopped and there was silence. And then suddenly the voice replied, "I am the spirit of Kate Betts, and I've come to kill John Bell." Now, Kate Betts was a real person. In fact, she was a neighbour of the Bell family who accused John Bell of cheating her in a land deal years before. Now, she died after the dispute. We don't know exactly how she died, but apparently it was quite suspicious. And the legends say that she cursed the name of John Bell with her last dying breath. So now it appears that her spirit, or something pretending to be her, had returned to collect her debt. And collect she did. Now, these hauntings continued for weeks and weeks to months and months, and by now the whole town was aware of what was going on in the Bell's household. So much so that the townspeople started to name this malevolent being that was haunting John Bell and his family, and they named her the Bell Witch. And she wasn't shy about making a name for herself. See, this witch, she would sing hymns and she would quote the Bible, and then in the same breath, curse the family with explicit language. And with this, word of the haunting spread all across Tennessee. So people would travel miles to witness this witch. Visitors would ask the witch questions, things that they whispered to one another under their breath, and the voice would answer out loud out of nowhere. And when preachers they visited to pray to get rid of this being, she recited scriptures with them, word for word, and then mocked their accents. And she could mimic anyone, even though people that she'd never met. In fact, one evening, when a skeptic arrived and laughed that ghosts weren't real, the witch whispered in his ear, repeating his mother's name, his birthplace, and a secret he had told no one. He ended up screaming into the night and he never looked back. But in the end, it was John Bell himself who bore the witch's full fury. Now, she continued to haunt him and taunt him, and over the years, John Bell's health began to crumble. He developed tremors, and then paralysis, and his tongue would actually swell up, and his speech would slur. He literally began to waste away, and by the winter of 1820, he could barely leave his bed. One morning, John's son found him unconscious. On the bedside table sat a small glass vial filled with dark, sticky liquid. Now, when they asked the witch about it, she answered before anyone could speak. She said, "I gave Bell his medicine last night. He will never rise again." Soon after, John Bell died. During his funeral, witnesses claimed to hear the witch's laughter roll across the fields, high-pitched, echoing, and again, impossible to locate. And the mourners, they began to pray, and she sang a mocking hymn, and her voice carried all the way to the very edge of the property. And then, after that day, the witch just disappeared. Or so they thought. Years later, Betsy Bell, now a young woman, became engaged to a man called Joshua Gardner. Now, on the night of her engagement, the witch returned, but this time her voice was actually softer, almost kind, and she whispered, "Betsy Bell, don't marry Joshua Gardner, you'll never be happy." Now, Betsy, of course, she tried to ignore her, like she'd done for all these years the witch haunted her family, but the witch's voice followed her everywhere, in the fields, in the house, even in her dreams, and then finally, terrified, she broke off the engagement. And when she did, the witch whispered one last time, "That's better." And then she was gone. Historians have argued for 2 centuries about what actually happened in that farmhouse. Now, some say it was mass hysteria, born of fear and faith colliding in an isolated town. Others believe it was a cruel hoax, perhaps even an elaborate act of manipulation by someone close to the family. Then there are those who swear they have seen her. Because the Bell Witch story, that doesn't end in 1820, it lives on in the whispers of tourists, in the tremble of flashlight beams down near the Bell Witch Cave. Now, this cave lies near the old Bell property, and locals say that the air is colder than anywhere else in Tennessee. And sometimes if you go alone and whisper, you'll hear the witch whisper back. But that's not all. You see, when the old Bell home was finally demolished, workers unearthed something buried beneath the floorboards near John Bell's bedroom. A small glass bottle. It's cloudy, chipped, and half filled with black residue. Now, no one could explain how it got there, but every eyewitness account, written decades before, mentioned the same vial. It was as though the witch had left a signature, a calling card, if you will, for anyone who doubted that she was real. Today, Adams, Tennessee embraces its haunted legacy. And every October, visitors gather at the Bell Witch Cave, carrying flashlights and crosses, daring each other to speak the name of the witch. Now, some swear that they've heard laughter echo through the dark, and others, they've seen shadows move long after everyone else has gone home. And yet, no one who's visited the site ever forgets the feeling of the cold air and the heavy silence and the faint impression that someone is standing just behind them. So maybe the Bell Witch was vengeance, maybe she was madness, or maybe she was something a lot older, something that feeds into belief and waits in the dark for those who listen a bit too closely. So if you ever find yourself in Adams, Tennessee, and you feel the urge to call her name, remember this: she's still listening, and once you've heard her whisper yours, you'll never truly be alone again. If you sit around enough fires long enough and late enough, you'll eventually hear a story about a place that doesn't feel right. It's a town where the fog rolls in so thick you can barely see through it, and where the wind never stops whispering. And even when the bravest of locals don't stay out after dark. Well, there's one valley just like that, a small forgotten place by the Hudson River in New York, beautiful by day and pure nightmare by night. The story begins in the autumn of 1790 when a stranger rode through that very valley. Now, he came all the way from Connecticut, and he was a school teacher. In fact, he was more than just a school teacher, he was the teacher in charge of the small, tiny school located in this valley. His name was Ichabod Crane, and he was tall and gangly and awkward looking, to be honest with you. He was a man with more bones than muscle, and much like his last name, he had a long neck and a sharp nose and a smile so thin it could slip through a keyhole. But what people remembered most about him wasn't how he looked, it was how he listened. You see, he was incredibly attentive, and when people spoke, he genuinely showed interest in what they have to say. In fact, he had this habit of leaning forward when people spoke, his eyes wide like he wanted to swallow every single word. And in a town like this, a town that ran on gossip and ghost stories, it made him very popular. So every night after supper, he would head to the tavern and he would sit near the fire and he would ask questions that actually made people feel uncomfortable. So he would ask, "Do you believe in spirits, or have you seen anything unusual?" And the locals, they humoured him, but the old ones, the ones who'd seen too much, they didn't laugh. Instead, they'd had enough. For them, ghosts and spirits, they just weren't arbitrary stories, they were real. And they decided it was time to tell Archibald Crane about the headless soldier. So the story goes that not far away from the very tavern that they were in, there was once the site of a great war, and not just any war, the American Revolutionary War. Now, this was devastating. It was a devastating war for everyone affected and involved, including the soldiers who were forced to battle. Among these soldiers was a Haitian. Now, a Haitian was a term for a German mercenary who was hired by the British to fight during the war. And this particular Haitian was fierce and fast, and he never missed the mark. But in that battle, he was struck by a cannonball, which not only killed him, but he actually took his head clean off. Now, the townspeople, they did the right thing and they buried his body, or at least what was left of him, by the old church near the bridge. But the problem was they never found his head. So the legend goes that on nights when the fog comes in thick and the moon is low, you can hear the pounding of the hooves in the valley. It's a rider racing through the mist, searching for something he'd lost. Hearing the story, Ichabod Crane turned completely pale, because he knew exactly which bridge the old man was talking about. You see, Ichabod Crane lived just out of town, and to get to and from the tavern every night, he would have to travel by horseback through a country forest. And what lied beyond the line of trees that outlined this forest was a river. And if you follow that river down, you would eventually come past a bridge near the old church. The old church where the Hessian soldier was supposedly buried, and the very bridge that was said to be haunted by that very soldier. So ever since he arrived in this valley town, he would have a feeling of dread every time he was on that road. And that feeling was so bad that it would actually make his horse gallop through it every night, and he would refuse to glance behind him. As he rode home that evening, Ichabod was even more anxious, especially when he was finally near the very bridge that was supposedly haunted by the Hessian soldier. Now, the only thing that he could find solace in was the final thing that the old man said when he finished his story, that whilst the ghostly rider haunted the roads and the bridge, he couldn't cross the bridge. That was a boundary, the line between this world and whatever lies beyond it. A few weeks later, the richest family in the valley, the Van Tassels, held their annual harvest board. Now, Ichabod, he dressed in his best coat and even hired an elegant and noble looking horse called Gunpowder to take him to the Van Tassels farmhouse for the party. But he wasn't just there to socialise. Him being there was a little bit more deliberate, because he was looking for someone, a woman called Katrina, or more specifically, Katrina Van Tassel, the only child and the heir to the Van Tassel's fortune. You see, whilst the locals thought that Ichabod rode into this valley with seemingly good intentions, his true intentions were sinister. He had heard about the Van Tassel's wealth long before he knew of this valley, and his goal was to woo Katrina and marry her not for love, but so that he could steal her family's wealth. So that night, Ichabod continued to woo and charm Katrina, and it worked. She laughed at his jokes, complimented his manners, and things were looking really good. Ichabod's riz was clearly working, or so he thought, because he wasn't the only one who was trying to get Katrina's affection. There was another person who was more of a thug than gentleman, called Abraham Brombones Van Brunt. Now, he was a character in the town. He had these broad shoulders and he rode horses incredibly well, and he was known as being this prankster, a jokester. And Ichabod, well, he was often a victim of these pranks because Brombones saw Ichabod as his enemy and the one person standing between him and Katrina Van Tassel. And therefore, Brombones would often find ways to trick and humiliate Ichabod. And it would actually work because Ichabod was so gullible. He believed everything that anyone said, much like how he believed in all the ghost stories that were told in the tavern. Ichabod, he continues to talk to Katrina and he's drinking and laughing, and meanwhile Brombones, he's in the corner, furious at what he's looking at. And he's seeing Katrina appearing to just fall in love with Ichabod. But then, all of a sudden, Katrina slaps Ichabod in the face and everyone stops and they look around. We don't know why she did it. We don't know whether it was because Ichabod insulted her family or was rude to her, or perhaps Katrina finally rejected Ichabod. But what we do know is that whatever it was public and everyone saw what happened. And Ichabod, he felt everyone's eyes on him. He had been publicly humiliated and shamed. So he staggers outside, his heart's pounding, his pride clearly bruised. So and he mounts Gunpowder and he just begins to ride home. That night, the moon hung low, and the road that would ordinarily twist around the trees, well, you could barely see it because it was lost in this deep, thick fog. And every few minutes, Ichabod, he would glance over his shoulder and see nothing but fog. But the deeper he rode, the quieter the forest became. There was no wind, there was no sound of crickets, not even the sound of the bustling river, which theoretically would have been right next to him. Just silence. And then hoofbeats. Now at first it was faint, then it became deeper and louder, and he felt like it was closer. Now Ichabod, he froze, and then he looked back. Emerging from the mist was a dark figure on horseback, tall, broad, and headless. Now Ichabod, he didn't waste a single second. He spurred his horse forward, and the rider behind him followed, closing the distance with every breath. Suddenly, Ichabod sees a bridge up ahead, the one the legend said the ghost could never cross. So he kicks Gunpowder harder, and the horse stumbles for a second, but then surges forward, and they fly across the bridge. Now Ichabod, he looks back, and you can see that this headless soldier has stopped, just like the legend said it would. And Ichabod, he starts to laugh, and a relief washes through him like warm rain. And then he sees it. The rider raises something in his hand, round and burning orange, and he hurls it at Ichabod, and he strikes him square in the chest. And all of a sudden, everything goes black. At dawn, the villagers find a horse wandering near the bridge, muddy, shaken, reins torn, and on the ground, there's a hat, the same hat that Ichabod was seen wearing the night before, and then beside it, a shattered pumpkin. With that, Ichabod was never seen again. Now, some say that Ichabod had been humiliated, and he fled the town in shame after being rejected by Katrina Van Tassel. Others who knew of the rivalry between Brom Bones and Ichabod thought that Brom Bones had had enough of this stranger, and he wanted to play one final prank to finally get rid of his enemy. But a select few claim that this was not a coincidence at all. In their minds, the story of the Hessian soldier was real. A thin figure riding in the fog, headless, silent, forever chasing something that he could never catch. Except this time, he did. A sullen victim in the name of Ichabod Crane. If you enjoyed tonight's Halloween special, don't forget to like this video. It helps more people discover these mysteries. And if you haven't already done so, subscribe and turn on all the notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly stories. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I'm Raphael Rogerson, and I'll see you on the next one.